the sound stopped him completely. Not the wind. Not the groaning of ice shifting somewhere deep in the ridge above him. Something else. Something raw and wrong, like an animal making a noise it was never supposed to make. Daniel Hayes had spent the better part of 12 years moving through places like this. Remote. Frozen. Indifferent to human beings, he had photographed wolves in Siberia, tracked brown bears through the Carpathian lowlands, and once spent 4 nights alone on a glacial shelf in Norway waiting for a single perfect shot of an Arctic fox. He was not easily rattled. He was not someone who startled at shadows. But that sound made his chest tighten. He stopped walking. The crunch of his boots in the packed snow went silent, and he just stood there in the white nothing of the Yukon backcountry. Listening, the wind pushed against him, hard and dry and cold enough to make his eyes water through his goggles. The sky above the canyon was the color of an old bruise, that heavy pre-storm gray that serious mountain people learned to respect. He had maybe 2 hours before the conditions turned. The sound came again. It was high and ragged and full of something desperate. Not quite a scream. Not quite a growl. Something that lived uncomfortably between the two. Daniel pulled his binoculars from inside his parka, where he kept them warm against his chest so the lenses wouldn't fog. He scanned the canyon wall across from him, working methodically from the base up toward the ridge line. Loose shale. Frozen runoff. A band of pale limestone that jutted out in a series of narrow shelves about 2/3 of the way up the face. Then he found her. She was tawny and gray and barely distinguishable from the rock she was pressed against, which was part of why he almost missed her entirely. A Canada lynx, full grown, her massive tufted ears flattened back against her skull, her broad padded paws scrabbling against the ledge beneath her. She was maybe 60 feet below the canyon rim, on a shelf that looked barely wider than a man's forearm, and her back left leg was wedged into a crack in the rock, jammed in at an angle that made Daniel wince just to look at it. She couldn't get it out. She had been trying. He could see the marks her claws had made on the limestone around the crack, long, desperate scratches in every direction, like she had tried every possible angle and found nothing that worked. The rock around the crack was crumbling, breaking away in chunks from the frost heave that had been quietly splitting the canyon wall all winter. Every time she pulled, the crack shifted. Every time the crack shifted, more stone fell away beneath her. Below that ledge, the canyon dropped a very long way down. Daniel lowered the binoculars and stood very still for a moment. He noticed something else through the glass, something that made his breath slow down in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The lynx was carrying weight. Her belly was swollen and low, unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. She was pregnant. Late in the pregnancy, by the look of it, days, maybe, not weeks. He thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then he started moving. The near side of the canyon had a descent route he had scouted that morning out of habit, never imagining he would need it. He moved fast, keeping his weight low, the temperature dropping in that particular way that started in the fingers and worked inward. At the base, he crossed a frozen creek and started up the opposite wall, the handholds glazed with fresh ice, his arms burning, his lungs working hard in the thin air. He could hear her again as he climbed. That sound, closer now, and if anything, more exhausted. The ferocious energy of pure panic slowly wearing itself down into something quieter and more frightening. He came around a bulge of rock, and she was suddenly right there. maybe 20 feet above him, on her crumbling shelf, looking directly down at him. Daniel had been close to Lynx before, through a lens, across safe distances. He thought he understood their size. But there is a difference between knowing something and feeling it. She was compact and dense and coiled with a kind of physical tension that made her seem larger than she was. And her eyes held nothing that any house cat had ever held. Pale gold. Wide and unblinking and completely focused on him as though nothing else in the world existed. He stopped climbing. He understood what she was seeing. A large, strange creature moving toward her from below. In her world, that meant one thing. Threat. Predator. Something that had come to finish the job the mountain had started. Daniel knew better than to rush. He knew better than to make any sound that could be read as aggression. He pressed himself against the rock face and just stayed there, breathing slowly, letting her look at him for as long as she needed. He kept his own eyes slightly averted, which every experienced wildlife person knows is the right instinct. Direct eye contact reads as a challenge. He talked to her, not words that meant anything, just sound. Low and even and unhurried. The kind of voice you use with a frightened child at 3 a.m. The kind of voice that says nothing bad is coming. Just this slow, steady rhythm of breath and tone and presence. She hissed at him. A long, sibilant warning sound, her upper lip pulling back to show teeth that were not small. Her trapped leg shifted and she flinched with pain and then went very still. Daniel reached into the pocket of his parka and found the strip of dried meat he kept there as emergency rations. Elk jerky. Dense and pungent, the kind of smell that carries in cold air. He held it out toward her for a moment, then tossed it gently up onto the ledge, as far from her as he could manage without it going over the edge. She watched it land. She watched him. She looked at the meat again. A full minute passed. Maybe longer. The wind moved around the canyon wall between them, carrying nothing. Then she lowered her head and sniffed at it. Daniel began to climb again. Slowly. Each movement announced in advance, nothing sudden, nothing aggressive. Just a steady, careful upward progress toward a ledge that was entirely too small for both of them. When he reached it, he understood just how bad the situation was. The crack had closed around her leg like a slow trap, frost and rock slide pressure working together against her. Her paw below the crack was swollen and dark. She had been here since before dawn. The ledge itself was barely wide enough for one of them. Daniel pressed his back against the wall and gave her every inch he could. He could feel the void behind her through some instinct of his own. That awareness of enormous empty space just beyond the edge of solid ground. She watched him reach for the rock hammer. She tensed at the sound of it unclipping. But she didn't strike. He worked with his left hand, anchoring him to the wall, and his right hand driving short. Controlled strikes into the upper lip of the crack. Every impact vibrated through the ledge. Every vibration made her flinch. But she had stopped hissing. She had stopped baring her teeth. She just watched him with those pale, exhausted eyes, her sides heaving. The cold was stiffening his fingers, slowing his thinking. Chunks of limestone disappeared into the canyon below. He forced himself not to listen for them landing. On the 8th or 9th strike, the crack gave. Not all at once. A section of the upper wall fractured along a hidden seam, and the whole geometry of the trap changed, loosening enough that when the lynx pulled her leg, it came free. She collapsed immediately. Not sideways, not toward the edge. Straight down, her legs folding under her, dropping onto the ledge in a heap of gray tawny fur and ragged breathing. Daniel pressed himself hard against the wall and did not move. She lay there for a long time, her injured leg extended, her eyes half closed, her sides working like bellows. He had expected her to find some reserve of wild energy and go, to scramble up the wall and vanish over the canyon rim the way her kind always vanished. Like smoke, like a thought you couldn't quite hold on to. But she didn't move. Whatever reserves had kept her fighting through those long, cold hours had been completely spent. She was not going anywhere on her own. He looked up. The canyon rim was 50 feet above them. He looked down. The canyon floor was much further than that. Leaving her here meant she would be dead by morning. The temperature was already falling toward the kind of numbers that ended things. He could not reach help and return in time. He knew that the moment he looked at her, he could not leave her here. He had the gear. He had always carried more than he thought he needed, a habit that other photographers teased him about and that had saved him twice before. 2 ropes, anchor hardware, a backup harness he had never used. He ran through it in his mind the way a pilot runs through a checklist, slow and deliberate, keeping his breathing even, because the math only worked if he stayed calm enough to think it through. While he was thinking, something happened that he was not prepared for. The lynx lifted her head. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that Daniel would later describe, inadequately, as something almost like recognition. Then she began to move, slowly, dragging herself across the narrow ledge toward him. He went completely still. She reached him. She pressed her broad, heavy-furred head against his thigh, just rested it there, all that weight of exhaustion and trust in a single gesture. Her sides were still heaving. Her injured leg was held slightly off the ledge. She was shaking, a fine, continuous tremor that he could feel through the fabric of his insulated pants. Daniel Hayes had spent 12 years in the backcountry. He had seen extraordinary things. He had been close to wild animals in ways that most people never experienced. But he had never had a wild animal choose him, choose to rest against him, choose to trust him in the way that only the truly desperate can trust a stranger. He did not move for a long time. Then, very slowly, he reached into his pack and found his secondary harness, the lightweight backup he carried for technical traverses. He worked it carefully around her midsection, above the swollen belly, tightening it just enough to be secure without causing distress. She let him. She didn't like it. He could feel her muscles tense and shift as he worked, but she let him. She was too far past fighting to fight anymore. He clipped her harness to his own with a length of sling and checked the connection twice and then a third time. He tested his anchor points above, throwing his weight against them until he was satisfied. Then he looked up at 50 feet of cold limestone and thought about all the reasons this was a genuinely terrible idea. He started to climb. The weight was extraordinary, not just her weight, though that was significant, but the awkwardness of it, the shifting, living counterbalance of another creature strapped to him and moving with its own unpredictable rhythms. She rode on his back and against his left side, her uninjured legs finding purchase on the wall occasionally, which helped more than he expected. She seemed to understand in some wordless way that she should not struggle. She pressed herself against him and held on with her good legs and let him carry the rest. His hands were burning. His shoulders had locked into a deep, grinding ache that traveled up his neck with every pull. The kind of pain that stops being pain and starts being just the texture of the effort itself. The crampons found holds and lost them and found them again. He talked to her the whole way up. That same low, steady voice, keeping himself calm as much as keeping her calm, because the distance between calm and catastrophe on a wall like this was measured in fractions. Halfway up, he stopped on a marginal ledge and just breathed for a full minute. His vision had narrowed at the edges. He was working harder than his body wanted to work, and the altitude was making everything cost more than it should. Below him, the canyon had gone dark, the light leaving the lower walls faster than it was leaving the sky. He thought about a lot of things in that minute. He thought about whether this was survivable. He thought about what the Lynx weighed and what the remaining distance was and whether his arms had enough left. He thought about the kits she was carrying, the little lives that would never see daylight if he quit here. He stopped thinking and started climbing. The last 10 feet were the hardest of his life. Not technically, but in every other way that mattered. His muscles had nothing left to give, and he was taking it anyway, reaching into some reservoir he hadn't known existed and drawing it down to nothing, hold by hold, foot by foot, until his hand found flat ground at the top of the canyon rim, and he pulled himself over it and lay there in the snow. She was still with him. He lay on his back and stared up at the sky, which had gone a deep purple black with the first stars appearing at the edges. He breathed. The Lynx lay across him and breathed too, her sides rising and falling against his chest. Neither of them moved for a long time. When Daniel finally had enough to sit up, he worked the connections loose and freed her from the harness. He pulled the emergency thermal blanket from his pack and spread it across them both, because the temperature was dropping fast and she was not in any condition to regulate her own heat. Around midnight, she shifted against him and tucked her face against the side of his parka in a gesture that was so purely domestic it made him laugh out loud in the dark. The laugh startled her, and she pulled back and regarded him with offended dignity, which made him laugh again. By the time the sky started turning that pale, cold gray of early morning, she was sitting up on her own. She stood, slowly, testing the injured leg in the snow. She took a few steps. The leg was bad, but not broken, he thought, or perhaps fractured lightly. She would carry it funny for a while, but she would walk. She would more than walk. She turned and looked at him. Daniel had tried many times afterward to describe that look and had never managed to do it justice. It was not the look of a domestic animal regarding a familiar person. It was something far more specific. An acknowledgement. A moment of genuine mutual recognition between two creatures who had been, for a few extraordinary hours, genuinely necessary to each other. Then she turned and walked into the rocks and disappeared. He packed up his gear in the gray morning light and started the long walk back to his base camp. His shoulders ached with every step. His hands were stiff inside his gloves. He did not expect to see her again. He was sitting outside his tent 3 weeks later, early morning, both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that was already going cold, watching the light come up over the ridge. He heard a sound, soft and close. He turned slowly. She was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 yards out, watching him. She looked different. The swollen belly was gone. She was lean and bright-eyed and moving easily, the injured leg carrying her weight without visible trouble. She was not alone. 2 kits stood close behind her, still small enough that their paws looked enormous compared to the rest of them, their tufted ears absurdly oversized, their eyes wide and curious and full of everything they had not yet learned to be afraid of. She watched Daniel for a long moment. The kits watched him too. pressed close against her sides, taking their cues from her. She was not hiding. She had brought them to the edge of the open ground and stood there in plain sight and let him see them. Daniel did not move. He barely breathed. He just looked at them in the morning light, these small new lives that were here because of a choice made on a crumbling ledge in a place where the wind never stopped. After a long moment, she turned and walked back into the trees. The kits went with her, bounding in that clumsy, oversized way of young things. And then the trees closed around all of them and they were gone. Daniel sat there for a long time after that. His coffee was completely cold. He didn't notice. He had come to the Yukon to photograph the wilderness. He had not expected the wilderness to look back at him like that, with two small faces pressed against the cold morning air, and leave him sitting in the snow feeling like the luckiest man alive. What Daniel witnessed was extraordinary. But the pressure bearing down on that lynx is not. The Canada lynx has been federally listed as threatened in the contiguous United States since the year 2000. Fewer than a few hundred individuals survive below the Canadian border. In Washington state, biologists believe the number may be as low as a few dozen. In Maine, 49 lynx were killed by vehicles in a single decade. And in November of 2024, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released the first ever federal recovery plan for the species, identifying climate change as the primary threat and proposing protected critical habitat across 6 states. The wilderness is shrinking. The margin for survival is narrowing. Every kit that makes it is a victory that almost did not happen